Welcome. Thanks everybody for joining us today. My name is Michael Kramer. I'm an account executive here at CompliancePoint. CompliancePoint is a professional services organization, and our main role is to help our customers translate what compliance means to them. So we take a very practical approach to compliance, security, and even privacy. So with that said, I do want to cover a couple housekeeping items before we get into the webinar. We will be sending out the slide deck and recording post-webinar, so everybody attending will be getting that. And then if you do have any questions, we'll make sure that we do spend some time at the end, about 10 or 15 minutes, to answer those questions. If not, feel free to reach out to either one of us. We'll be happy to schedule some one-on-ones or maybe a 30-minute session with Carol to talk about a specific situation. So that said, I am really excited to introduce you to our main speaker today. I work very closely with Carol Amick over here. She leads our healthcare services practice, and really the way I like to introduce her to our customers from a professional perspective is she's been on both sides of the fence. So she's been on the provider side, really in the weeds, dealing with compliance issues that might come up, and she gets those growing pains, or she gets the, what it takes to respond to certain security questionnaires. So she gets that side of the house, and then we're fortunate enough to have her on our team and lead our healthcare practice because, she's taken those problem solving, that experience, and really leveraging it across our customer base. So excited to introduce her to you guys from a professional standpoint. But one thing that Carol and I did, I wanted to bring up with her before was, something personal about her. And, you can catch her watching the Tennessee Vols football, when football season does hopefully come back for us. But if you can't catch her watching Vols football, you can catch her on the weekends with her Girl Scout troop doing some charitable work. So all that said, I'm going to hand it over to you, Carol, and we can get started on managing your HITRUST certification.
Thank you, Michael. That was a great introduction. So we are going to talk today about managing your HITRUST certification, and there's several parts to that we're going to cover. One is the certification process. These are kind of subsections of that, actually: the corrective action plans, your interim assessments, dealing with HITRUST updates, and continuous monitoring. And then we're going to focus a little bit on increasing your control maturity from certification to certification. So as we start, let's look at why you might have decided to get HITRUST certified. Most of my clients, to be honest, get HITRUST certified to meet the contractual requirements of a business partner or a client. But there are other reasons, one of which, of course, is to reduce the time required to respond to those security questionnaires Michael mentioned. You get a lot of them, I know. HITRUST touts itself as a certify once, respond numerous times. So you can do your certification and you can just send that out instead of filling out those questionnaires. And of course, it also demonstrates to your customers and clients that you literally have adopted one of the gold standards in certification for cybersecurity and are doing your best to protect their data. HITRUST, as you know, started in the healthcare industry. And HITRUST says they've been adopted by 81% of the hospitals and 80% of the health plans as either a best practice resource or basis for their information program. So it does set you apart. HITRUST has actually, from the last year, started going agnostic and is working on some other industries. Michael, what have you heard about that?
Yeah, Carol, thanks for that. And actually, in talking with our customers from a business perspective, we're actually hearing, I've heard a couple rumors in the airline industry, and then them adopting on the financial services side. I know they've, which we'll speak to a little bit on their updates, they've started tying the framework into GDPR. So interested to see how it grows. But we're certainly seeing it outside of the healthcare services, front and other verticals.
So let's start with just an overview of the HITRUST certification process. This is kind of a circular view of the HITRUST certification process. You started at the top. You got if you're on this call, you probably have your HITRUST certification, or you're thinking about getting it and wanting to see what's involved after you get it. So you've gotten your certification, you've issued your press release, you take a deep breath and you move on to other things. But the truth is there's a lot that still has to be done to keep that certification valid and functioning. You have your corrective action plans that need to be worked on, and they need to have shown either completion or good progress by the time of your interim assessment, which comes in a year. Then you have to adapt for any updates HITRUST might have made before your next certification cycle. You may want to look at increasing your control maturity so that you look better when your clients compare your reports year over year. And of course, through all this, there's also a lot of continuous monitoring activities that HITRUST requires that you have to have done. So this is kind of a never-ending cycle.
So Carol, best case, jumping in here, sorry. So best case
Okay.
scenario, we're looking at this cycle, customer just got their validated assessment. We're managing that HITRUST program now. What's best case scenario for what this cycle looks like from a timeline perspective? Are we talking a year? Are we talking 2 years?
So that's a really interesting question, because a lot of people think that the HITRUST validation date is the date they get the report back from HITRUST. But in truth, it's the date that your external assessor, somebody like me, hit the button and sent that assessment to HITRUST. And I'll give you an example. We had an assessment we submitted just before Thanksgiving that they got their validated report back about 2 weeks ago. So you can see there's a lag there between that. But their interim date is a year from the date they submitted. So their interim will be due just before Thanksgiving this year. And that's something you need to keep in mind when you're doing a corrective action plan, because you want to make sure you don't overpromise when you really probably only have 8 months to do it. The other thing, the validated, if you submit it when you're submitting it a year, November of 2022, for example, it could be December again before you get your report back. So if you want to keep your letter current, you may wind up moving your validation date, start date back some. That's something you can discuss with your external assessor as you get close to that time period. So you got your assessment back, and if you're like most people, you have corrective action plans. I don't know that I've ever seen an assessment without one. If you're one of the lucky people, I'd love to talk to you and find out how you did it. So for most people, though, you're going to get a corrective action plan out of your assessment. It's basically for any requirement statement that you had that scored below a 3+, which is about 70 points or so. It's going to require a corrective action plan. And those fall into 2 categories: the policy and process, which basically amounts to drafting, approving, publishing. So if you had gaps in your processual document, for example, you would do that. And the other is implementation, technology, and manual processes. So you may have to buy some technology, you may have to do some documentation. The policy process one you can do fairly quickly by comparison. So a lot of people start with that so they can have that done and show that progress by the time of their interim, and then they work on the implementation over a little longer period. You do your CAPs in the HITRUST portal. When you first get your HITRUST assessment back, you have to fill this out. You have to put in your name, the name of the CAP, you call it something, policy documentation, what you're going to do, and your status at that point, of course, is not started usually, unless you've been working on them in advance. As you go through the process of completing your PAP, you need to keep this updated, because this is what HITRUST is going to lose, this documentation in the portal. So they're going to want to know what your status is when your interim comes around. And if you have documents that you can ask down here under the risk analysis documents, that's going to help both you and your assessor. Some of the others, it's good to fill out if you want to use it. It's not required by HITRUST, but it does give you good information. When you get ready to do your interim, you and your assessor need to agree on where you are with your CAP documentation. So when I go in as your assessor and I look at it and it says not started, but the truth is you've done it, that's because you haven't updated this. So this does need to be updated and agree with your assessor.
Hey, Carol, jumping in right here. So I know I've got a lot of customers that I talk to that, they're managing compliance across the board. So, outside of HITRUST, they might have a PCI program that they're managing, and, they have these GRC tools that are native to their environment, or they've been using for, a while now. Can you integrate this into the GRC tools that, are the main ones out there, or how does that work?
Actually, it doesn't really integrate well. you have to put this in manually. So a GRC tool is great if you have the manpower and the time to keep it up. I mean, they are intensive. I get people who buy GRC tools and really feel like that's going to help them, but the truth is, you still have to spend the time and have the manpower to deal with it. But if you use a GRC tool before you do your interim, you will need to go into your HITRUST portal and you will need to enter that information because there's no integration with any GRC tool that I've ever heard of. So you've been working on your caps, you feel like you just finished your validated, and now your assessor has contacted you about doing your interim assessment. And if you've been down this road before, I wanted to go over some changes that HITRUST has made to the interim assessment process. It is now completed in the MyCSF portal. You may have before gotten a spreadsheet from your assessor, you filled it out, you sent it back, it was kind of done. Now it's completed in the MyCSF portal and it's a little more robust, and we're going to talk about that. One of the first things your assessor has to do is confirm the scope, that there have been no significant changes in your business or security practices, and that you have not had a significant breach reportable to a state or federal agency.
So Carol, on that, I'm going to stop you real quick. So on that, the scoping part. So we had a customer that, specific customer example where I think this falls in line, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they got their validated assessment. They had an on-prem data center or on-site data center. They're looking to move to the cloud, perform that migration, and then, expected to go through the interim assessment. But, that was a pretty significant business change to them. So can you talk about that specific situation? Can you go into depth there?
So that is actually one we have had with a client, and it's kind of common. If between your validated assessment and your interim, you do make a change like moving to a cloud-based environment from a server-based environment, then you are not going to be able to do a interim assessment. You are going to have to do a validated assessment. If you are just kind of moving maybe from one data center to another and it's the same environment, it's the same operation, it's the same security type stuff, then you may not have to. What you want to do though is be sure to reach out to an assessor and talk to them about your plans, and make sure they know where you are so that they can work with you on that, because you certainly don't want to show up at the time of your interim assessment thinking you're going to have an interim assessment that's fairly low key and not near as intensive, and I'm only to be told, nope, we're going to have to revalidate all 500 controls. So you want to make sure you're communicating well throughout that. The other thing on the interim assessment will be the caps we talked about. The assessor will have to validate the progress of those caps. So if you're saying you're done, they're going to look and they're going to have to test the control. So let's say you had a cap related to just the policy and procedural document, but the implementation was great. I would still have to go in. I would look to see if your new policy and process was in place and looked good. And then I would have to test the control like I did the first time. So there is some testing going on for your caps to make sure you're still doing the control. And then additionally, HITRUST judgmentally randomly selects 19 controls or more. There's supposed to be one from each domain. I will tell you, I've gotten back a couple recently where I have more than 19, and I might have had 2 in one domain and 0 in another. So I'm not 100% sure how they pick that, but they do send you back the controls they want you to do. And those are tested just like they were on the original assessment to make sure the control is still working. So let's talk about the timing on that certification. We talked about it a little at the beginning when we were talking about the certification title, but I wanted to kind of give you a visual picture of it. This particular client submitted their original assessment to HITRUST on September 30th, 2019. Now, they probably got it back in December, January, so they've had their report for a while. At 90 days prior to their year end, they can open their interim assessment. They can contact HITRUST and say, we'd like to get started on our interim. And I would really recommend that you think about doing that, because that really gives you a lot of extra time. If you don't do that, however, 60 days prior to your year end, HITRUST is going to open your assessment for you and tell you, here's your assessment, get to work on it. So you're going to have to get started on it about 60 days in this case. And then you would have to submit it to HITRUST by the end of your year. So in this case, September 30th. Now, HITRUST will do the same kind of QA review they did on your validated. So they will go in and look at your assessor's comments, look at your assessor's work, ask questions, get an update on where you are. So it's pretty much similar in that respect, and that's a little different too than the old one, but they will be doing an assessment very similar to your old assessment. So you've survived your interim, you're on to the next year, you think you can you're going to finish your caps, you're in good shape. But there's a couple of things you need to pay attention to. And one is what HITRUST is updating. HITRUST prides themselves on periodic updates, at least once a year, to reflect changes in the cybersecurity environment. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Our the criminals are very fast and very smart, and we need to stay on top of it. So this is a summary of kind of some of their updates. The big one up there is the version 9 in 2017. It increased the number of controls to 75 and 66. But if you've been through the assessment, you know that even in that, under each control, there are levels. And so you could have had a significant number of increased controls from 2017 to 2019. And when you did your last assessment, if you just finished one, you probably noticed that. In 2018, they added the New York cybersecurity and their first pass at the GDPR. 2019, they added Singapore Data Protection Act, and they updated GDPR based on guidance from the EU that had come out since their original assessment. In 2019, they added the California Consumer Privacy Act, the South Carolina Insurance Data Security Act, and the NIST 800-171. Now, some of these will apply to you and some of these won't. You and your assessor will decide what goes together. For example, if you don't have any business in California, you may not have to do CCPA. If you don't have any European Union business, you may not want to pull the GDPR in. But if you do need to pull these in, they can be a significant number of new controls. And that can be a pain point if you don't look at this on an ongoing basis and you get to your new assessment and you start testing 90 days before it's due and you discover there's a whole bunch of controls you don't have in place. So you want to be sure those are in place. We do have version 10 expected, I think, almost any time. The original press release was last year, so I think it's probably due any time now. And I expect it to be significant. As Michael was talking about earlier, we're seeing interest in HITRUST from financial services and the airline industry and some others. And this is part of the version 10 will facilitate even more that, making the portal an agnostic tool for all industries. So I expect there to be some significant changes. So when that comes out, if your assessor doesn't get with you or you don't have somebody managing your process and helping you make sure that you're aware of these things, you'll want to pay attention to that. But even though they haven't given us a release update this year, they have done some really interesting things that we want to talk about. One is the changes to the Prisma weights, and the Prisma weights are the weights for each of your controls. We're going to talk about that in detail. They've also updated the scoring rubric for scoring, and we're going to talk about that in detail. And just last week, they issued updated scoping factors. Those will be effective in July, and that's going to allow your assessor, you and your assessor, when you're doing original scoping, to answer some questions and maybe knock out some controls that weren't truly applicable to you. And hopefully make the framework a little more tailorable. The other I didn't really mention in here was kind of last year, but it also is that they have formalized that a control has to be in place for 90 days before it can be considered mature and tested. So you need to think about that as you go along and you're looking at putting in new controls to meet the new standards.
This is sorry, Carol, jumping in. I know we talked to several customers with COVID-19 being, a big topic right now, and there being some, some on-site work with these going through a validated assessment. Has there been updates from HITRUST around COVID-19? What those on-site, what that looks like?
There have been. HITRUST has actually waived the on-site visit requirements, which has been very helpful. They are allowing your assessor firms to get their evidence any other way they can come up with. FaceTime videos, just regular video, people sending you pictures. I had a client right now, for example, we're in that situation and I needed evidence of a water detection system, and they're going to send me a picture of the water detection system so that I have the evidence I need that they have one. So HITRUST has done that. They have not issued any time limit waivers. They're still assisting their normal timelines, but they will consider on a case-by-case situation if you have a unique situation. So if you have a problem, get with your assessor and reach out to HITRUST. So the biggest change that may impact a lot of people is the weights, the Prisma weight changes. And basically, as you know, you get a weight, each control is assessed based on maturity level. And in 2019, policy, process, and implemented were 25% each. So 75% of the points were there. Measured and managed were 25 total. That give you 100 possible points for any control. In 2020, they've made a significant change. They have increased implemented to 40%, decreased policy to 15, decreased process to 20. Personally, I think this makes a lot of sense. You can write a great policy and a great process, but that does not mean that you have actually implemented the control that's protecting the confidential information in your care. So this forces a client to have done implementation to get a good passing rate score in HITRUST. Measured and managed combined still account for 25 points, but have flipped in sequence, managed being considered more important. What this does do, though, if you were one of these people who was really working, had great policy and process, and maybe your implemented evidence was a little weak, you really are going to have to make sure you beef that up because you want to get that score back up. You're not going to get as many points just for the policy and process going forward. So be sure to do that. If you have an interim coming up in the next year, it actually will use the 2019 weights. The interim assessment uses the weight that was in place at the time you did your assessment. And then there's this. This is the updated scoring rubric. This beautiful color thing, there's one section like this on the rubric. It's a big 8.5 by 11 piece of paper for each of the control maturity levels: policy, process, implemented, measured, and managed. This is just a sample. The scoring rubric has increased the level of prescriptiveness. It gives us a lot more guidance on what we are supposed to be looking at as assessors. It's formalized the scoring requirements. One of the big changes is that automated controls must be supported by policy and process documentation. It used to be that with an automated control, the process was kind of assumed because it was an automated control. Now you do need to have a process documentation. So if you haven't got those, you might want to start working on writing those up as you go forward, because that's going to be something your assessor is going to work for. And it's formalized some information on measured and managed, and we're going to talk about that a little later. But I wanted to walk you through this rubric for policy. As you can see on the left of the rubric is the policy strength, and across the top is how much of the elements do you get and what's your score. So if you don't have a policy, or you have an undocumented policy, which, for example, if you have a control, when I come in to do the assessment, I can see it's being done. I can interview your staff. They understand the policy. They understand how to do it. It's been implemented. You might get credit for an undocumented policy, which gives you somewhat compliant, which brings you over here to where you get 25% of those points. So in this case, you get 25% of 15 points. And then it goes all the way up. So tier 3 is you almost there, but you don't have all of the formal policy requirement. That gets you 75%. And then, of course, if your policy matches the control requirement perfectly, you get a fully compliant and 100%. And I would encourage you to work with your assessor firm or whoever helps you manage your HITRUST to make sure you get as much credit as you can for policy and procedure, because to me, that's pretty easy to document. Just get somebody to help you if you need it, and then you can get some great scores there. So the other thing we talked about at the beginning is that HITRUST also put onto you a lot of continuous monitoring things that have to be done. This is a snapshot of what had to be done from one of a kind of a medium-sized client. On an annual basis, you have to review your policies and procedures. You have to do a governance report. You have to do vulnerability and/or penetration testing. You have to do an incident response plan test and update your incident response. You have to update your business continuity plan. You have to evaluate your training effectiveness. And I can tell you that's a control where I find a lot of people, when I ask them for that one, they look at me with those kind of wide eyes and go, we didn't do that. On a biannual, you have to, every 6 months, you have to update your network diagram, and you have to verify that you don't have passwords that are on a list of commonly used compromised passwords. So you want to make sure no one's using password 1, for example. Um, and then quarterly, there's other things, the user access validation, the physical access validation, making sure that remote access, that people are reading that's appropriate. And then there's the ongoing stuff. Some of this you probably do automatically anyway. Updating your antivirus, your antivirus, probably pretty normal and routine for you. Others of it might not be. Visitor log reviews have to be reviewed every 60 days. Privileged user access has to be reviewed every 60 days. Those aren't always ongoing for people. When you did your first assessment, if you're just coming up on your first renewal, you might have only had evidence of some of this for just one time. For example, you might have only had, you put in new policies and procedures to get ready for your high trust assessment, and they have been reviewed and you were in good shape. But now when you come back up, your assessor is going to want to see that you have done them 2 more times since then. So you've got to make sure you're staying on top of this so you can get a good score in your next control assessment. And this is a lot of work, I know. And so, what we do with our clients is we set up kind of a tracking when we're managing it, and we work with them to make sure all these things get done on schedule and are documented. And that's another real key. If you're doing them, you want to make sure they're documented. So the last thing you have is the increasing control maturity. And as you go through your assessment, you had controls that probably didn't score as high as you like. And in going next year, you'll want to be sure and look better. One area where there's a lot of opportunity to increase your control maturity is the high trust measured and managed scoring. When I look at what I see traditionally in scoring and in assessments, measured and managed is probably an opportunity for a lot of enhancement. And the measurement guidance High Trust gave us this year gave us some real guidance on what we can do. This is what they want. They want you to address the controls operation. They want it performed at an appropriate frequency. And then this last bullet, they want what's measured, who's responsible, how's it recorded, how often is it calculated, how often is it reviewed, and who's responsible for reviewing. So if, for example, you were using to measure education, a dashboard from your LMS system that said everybody was trained, that no longer is going to get you there because you don't have who's responsible for making sure it's done. You don't have how often you're looking at it. You don't have what's the response, all those things. So you want to additionally have documentation of I reviewed the dashboard every 90 days to make sure all new hires were done timely and that everybody got trained annually and who's responsible and all those kind of things. So you want that now documented or you're not going to get credit. So here's the metric for measured and managed, the measurement system. And they've given us some guidance. If the measurement has an operational measure only, which means it's done by somebody who's responsible for the control, you're somewhat compliant, you get 25%. If you have an independent measure, you get to 50%. You have metrics, i.e., talking about our mythical education control, we expect 95% compliance, then you kind of added yourself to the 75 to 100%. So if you have an independent measure of your control against an established metric, you automatically increase your control maturity. And the independent measure can be done by somebody internal or external. So if you have an internal audit department, they can do it as long as they're not also the control owner. And I have seen that where the internal audit department is kind of the control owner. Or you can use a professional services firm to do it for you. So you could have a professional services firm do these measurements for you throughout the year, give you your scoring, and automatically beef you from the 25 to 50%. And then if you all come up with a metric, it automatically increases you to 100%. So you can see how that's going to bump up your control maturity. On managed, it's another one where I see a lot of opportunity because most of my clients manage the way I did when I was in industry. I get my measurement and there's something wrong. Only 50% of the people have finished the training and it's 2 weeks to go. So what I do is I pick up the phone and I call HR and I go, okay, what are we going to do to get the rest of our organization to have finished the compliance training by year end? I don't get much credit there. I need to have documented all of these things. Did I have a mechanism to define my issue? Did I have to take corrective action? What did I do? Who did I call? What did I say? If I needed to, did I escalate that to the vice president I might have been working for, going, we're only at 50%. What are we going to do? And did our decisions include cost, level of risk, mission impact? So you need to have some good documentation. This is where I find most of my clients are in the undocumented risk treatment, or maybe the documented with one criterion. So they're getting between 25 and 50% of the points there. As you noticed, this is worth more points now than it used to be. So it's worthwhile to think about doing some more documentation. When you get to all your criterion, you can get 15 points there, which helps a lot. So you want to have a formal risk treatment plan. If you have an external assessor or internal assessor, internal audit type thing helping you with them, they can help you, guide you on that documentation. We used to get responses to my internal audits when I was an internal audit. Would have a lot of that and would actually show that you have managed the risk. So that's another tool to use. So we talked a little bit about this in the last section when we talked about the internal assessor for increasing your control maturity. But you also can use internal assessors for some other purposes. This is something HITRUST has given some guidance on this year. And probably to me, one of the most useful tips I got out of the guidance was that the internal assessor can assist the internal assessor with the testing, potentially reducing costs and extending the testing period. And in this mythical example here, my client wants to submit December 31st of 2020, which is very common. I think a lot of people tell their board and their governing bodies they're going to get HITRUST certified this year. So fourth quarter, we have to get this certification in. So that means in the fourth quarter, when you also have all those other initiatives that need to be done in 2020 still kind of riled up, I'm going to be calling you on the phone. I'm going to be coming to visit. I'm going to be interviewing your people. There's going to be a couple of assessors doing stuff. You're going to have kind of an impact on your operations. And having been an internal auditor and having been in business, I've had both sides of that. So I know that anytime we do this, we're impacting your operation. If you use an internal assessor, however, they can start testing the controls assigned to them 6 months before your assessment date. So they could start as early as July. And that lessens that operational impact throughout your organization. So that's a great benefit. Now, one of the things you want to be sure you do is that your internal assessor and your external assessor work together. So don't just give your internal assessor a bunch of things to do, and when your external assessor shows up, go, here, they've done all this. That's not the way this works. It really needs to be an agreement, probably starting about now, talking about using an internal assessor and figuring out who's going to do what your external assessor wants documented, how they want it documented. All those decisions have to be made. The internal assessor also, as we said, can perform the ongoing testing to demonstrate control maturity. Now, your internal assessor can be either an internal or an external resource. So if you have an independent internal audit shop, it can be the internal assessor. If you don't, it can be an external consulting firm, like a CompliancePoint, for example. It cannot be the same consulting firm that does your audit, your external audit. So it's going to have to be two different firms. And so that's the other reason you want to get them together in the summer, if you're going for a year end, to talk about what's going to happen and who's going to do what and how it's all going to work, because it does involve two firms. But it can give you a real benefit to reducing your time. And of course, the internal assessor, even if it's an external firm, may be less expensive because we're not budgeting to do the management of a job and the interaction with HITRUST that comes later on in the engagement.
Yeah, Carol, that was great. Thank you for, as we close out, thank you for all of that. I think being able to hear the examples of, when you're on the provider side, you in the trenches, in the weeds, that was awesome. And then now, taking that experience and being a problem solver for our customers, that, I'd say the two main takeaways that I had was, we talk about HITRUST certification, and we talk about, HITRUST is certainly expanding outside of the healthcare services industry. And I think, as we look at this certification, we need to treat it as more of a program. There's a lot of changes that not only HITRUST is making throughout the year, those updates that we saw, but we saw the continuous monitoring, what it takes on the back end to make sure that, to my second point, my second biggest takeaway was the documentation was there. A lot of the customers, a lot of the clients, a lot of the prospects that we talk to, they may have those continuous monitoring pieces in place, but the documentation, the policies, the procedures aren't there. So those were the two big takeaways that I had. Carol, I appreciate you really kind of just going through how CompliancePoint can help out in managing your HITRUST certification or program. And then, now just to wrap things up from a housekeeping perspective, as I mentioned up front, we'll be sending out the slide deck and the recording. And then right now, I'd like to open it up to any questions.
So we have a few questions, and I'll try to get through them. I know we're already a little over time, and I appreciate you all bearing with us. We have a question. One question was, after 2 years from certification, what's the process for the next 2 years? And basically, it's a big cycle. Every 2 years, you have to do a full validated assessment, just like you did the first time, where all your controls are tested. Your scope is re-examined to see how many controls you have. So if you have grown, you may have more controls than you had last year. And of course, the impact of those updates we talked about. So it's basically a never-ending cycle. Every 2 years, you do a full assessment, and on the interim year, you do an interim assessment. So I hope that helps. If you've got additional questions, feel free to contact me. I've also had a question from Joseph Jackson about the internal assessors and their special training. Yes, your internal assessors do need to be certified by HITRUST, so they need to have this HITRUST certification. Right now, if you are interested in doing that, HITRUST is actually doing, because of COVID-19, is doing an online class, so that might be a good way to do it if you want to do that going forward. But you do need to have them certified. So if you're looking at a firm to do it, you can see if they've got certified assessors. And if not, if you want to use your internal audit, you probably want to get some people to go through that training. And the last question was about independent measure. Yes, you can use a PCI or an ISO audit, but now you need to map it control to control to your HITRUST control. So for example, if your PCI auditor said the wireless was not in scope because it wasn't in scope for your payment card, but it's still going to be in scope for HITRUST. So in that case, you couldn't use it. But there are a lot of other controls that do map one-to-one, and that automatically gets you to a measured assessment. So that is something that does help a lot if you've got those. I also wanted to give a shout out to Lou for thanking for his Go Balls thing. Hopefully we'll all get to watch football this year. You can see on the screen our contact information. Michael and I are glad at any time to help you, set up time, talk to you about HITRUST and what's involved. If you have more in-depth questions, particularly about how you get certified or how you keep your certification or what we can do to assist you, feel free to reach out to us at any time. For those of you who are online, we will be sending out a link to the webinar, so you will have it. And of course, if you want to share it with anyone, it'll be on our webpage. Thank you and have a good day.